Happy New Year, everyone. Happy New Year. So, without further ado, we're going to get into our first content of 2025, and it's going to be Domo3000's video series, essentially responding to Mauler. The video titles are somewhat focused on Mauler, are somewhat not focused on Mauler, so I'm a little confused on this series, exactly how much of it is a response versus just ranting and poking Mauler, I guess. But here we are. We're going to get directly into it. I know nothing about this creator. I know nothing about this video series, so it'll be a fresh take on this person's response to a Mauler's response. So we're entering what layer deep are we? So Dark Souls 2 comes out, then Matthew Matosis makes a video on it, then H Bomber Guy makes a video on Matthew Matosis's video on it, then Mauler makes a response series to H Bomber Guy's video. Then this guy makes a video series to Mauler's video series, and then I make a reaction to it. So we're on layer 6 at this point. We are reacting. Oh boy. Oh my God, not Domo. Here we go. Yeah, so just to lay this out in terms of what layering we're in, this is the 6th layer because we are reacting to a reaction to a reaction to sorry. We are reacting to a response, to a response, to a response, to a video game. So we are deep. We are in deep. Anyway, I'm glad you could show up early, Sheep. That's good. That's good. And one thing about this series is it's a series of videos that we have to get through. There's 11 in total, and they vary in length. So I'm thinking we might try to cover at least one per stream. So and some of them reach into the higher end. Some of them are like 15 minutes long. Some of them are like 12 minutes long. Some of them are like almost 40 minutes long. So there's a little bit of a wide berth for some of these videos. So we'll see what we do, how we do, and what's in these videos. I'm cautious, to say the least. So let's go ahead and get into this.
Damn, another enemy has joined the battle. I better run away backwards without even looking in order to handle this situation, but of course this just leads to an unfair ambush. I hope no one would take such complaints that are obviously based on skill issues seriously.
I was on my first ever approach to this area and decided to attack what looked to be a knight. Little did I realize that I was playing Dark Souls 2.
What would you do in this situation? Would you take care of the Hollow, or would you just ignore him and aggro the stronger-looking enemy? The Hollow would die in one hit, but let us see what Mauler does.
Is this guy AI? He sounds like AI. Let us see what this person would do. Let us see what their reaction to this encounter would be. It's like, I hope this isn't how he normally sounds. Just, it's an AI. Are you serious? Is this an actual AI voice? Because I could believe it. I could believe it.
And this man had about 5 times the health of my own, with a pet unicorn standing ready off-screen to swipe me off my feet.
I zoomed in a bit so that you can see that 1,190 damage takes away nearly half his health. This enemy has around 2,500 health, which is close to the amount that I'm estimating Mauler to have had. I'm at around 2,200 health here, which is a bit less than Mauler had.
I had 220 levels with over 70 points in endurance and maxed out every stat I needed with the benefit of being very experienced.
Mauler vastly exaggerated the amount of health this enemy has. With a plus...
Is this going to be one of those things where he nitpicks the shit out of every single thing Mauler says with completely missing the point? Let's go back to the beginning of this little section here, because so this might be a thing where I need to let him make his point and then respond to it, because if he's going to nitpick every individual thing, it might be better just to wait till he's done making the same point over and over.
Did I realize that I was playing Dark Souls 2?
What would you do in this situation? Would you take care of the hollow, or would you just ignore him and aggro the stronger looking enemy? The hollow would die in one hit, but let us see what Mauler does.
And this man had about 5 times the health of my own, with a pet unicorn standing ready off screen to swipe me off my feet.
I zoomed in a bit so that you can see that 1190 damage takes away nearly half his health. This enemy has around 2500 health, which is close to the amount that I'm estimating Mauler to have had. I'm at around 2200 health here, which is a bit less than Mauler had.
I had 220 levels with over 70 points in endurance and maxed out every stat I needed with the benefit of being very experienced.
Mauler vastly exaggerated the amount of health this enemy has. With a plus 10 S-stock, 50 strength, and 40 dexterity, I'm dealing roughly the same amount of damage as he did. But I'm pretty sure that an experienced player would bring damage boosting rings to this endgame co-op challenge. This
Or not. That's completely build like specific. Like that depends on what you're choosing to use during your build. He's going to nitpick everything and take all his exaggerating super seriously. Ah, okay, so that's what we're in for. So this is gonna be a slog. But I mean, it's one of those things too. Like when you go back to the Mauler clip, he's talking about how you find this enemy that has a good bit of health, right? And then the steed appears out of nowhere and attacks, right? Like these steeds are not naturally existing in this area, like this, right? Like the way that you're choosing to deal with his argument is to take your character, which you are clearly using cheats to orchestrate this encounter. You are showing an enemy off screen in the background right now that is not normally visible off screen. And then you are trying to make a point that this guy didn't have exactly, what was it, 5 times the health of Mauler at the time. Now, this is one thing where I would agree that, yeah, Mauler probably shouldn't have exaggerated that hard when it comes to that sort of thing. But I think his point is the ambush, not exactly the exact health of this thing.
would reduce the amount of hits needed from around 11 down to just 6 or 7, especially if you are also utilizing R2. He spammed R1 7 times, which means that he could have already defeated this enemy if he came prepared for this optional side challenge. And now imagine you are fighting this immensely overpowered enemy that gets staggered on every hit, and a reindeer shows up. If you want to look for cover, would you go back to safety where you came from, or would you run away in a random direction without even looking?
With a pet unicorn standing ready off screen to swipe me off my feet, so naturally I look for cover in order to protect myself. And what ensues? The spam bush.
Mauler went with the interesting approach of just running away in a random direction without first looking where he is running to. This is not a spam bush. This is just him running into a new and unknown location and aggroing the enemies there. He presents this as unfair, but he is just yet again blaming the game for his own bad decision.
So just to clarify that you understand what I'm saying, there are single enemy encounters that results in you making movements that are completely casual and natural that result in triggering more ambushes that result in a huge amount of enemies causing a spam bush.
At that point the game is
Wow, just there's such a lack of a response here. Where it's just like, he's wrong. Look at this. He's playing game wrong. Let me repeat point over and over for 24 minutes. I have a feeling this is where it's going to go. Bro, he can't see. Where do you want him to run to, LeMayo? Well, this is also a thing, too. He's completely forgetting that you're dealing with an enemy that is fast, has a ranged attack, and can spawn in the mist. Like talking about the demon reindeer, right? They spawn, and they will continue to spawn like every so often in the mist, right? Like taking your eyes off them means that you have to rely on sound to figure out how close they are to you, which is, frankly, in my opinion, not a good way to tell if an enemy is close or, I would rather look at them and run away. And while Mauler's strategy is not one that I would personally use, per se, Mauler does have a relatively weaker weapon by comparison to some of the other weapons available at that point. So I think it is a thing where I think Mauler reacted in the way that he would sort of deal with the situation, which is, back away from them and heal, and consequently he aggroes more enemies, right? I think part of the problem with this is that you have an area covered in mist, and so it's hard to get a good layout of the entire area before you end up running into more enemies, right? This is a layered thing to talk about and a layered thing to criticize, and this is one thing. While Mauler technically made a bad decision in the moment for that encounter, I believe what he was trying to show was a natural response to having this random ambush of multiple enemies that are tough in an area that largely restricts your vision and also spawns incredibly aggressive, fast enemies that deal high damage, those being the reindeer, right? This is a layered problem. This is a layered problem that, Mauler's point was the actual ambush leading into encounters with more enemies, not just random movement causing him to get into trouble. Oh goodness, a nutter reacting to most likely YouTube's biggest long form person who doesn't speak without scripting 3 months previously. Yeah. This is one thing, I saw his response, this response series apparently came out in over the course of 4 months, and most of them came out within a month of each other. So it's this feels like this would be a very short, rushed series just to be you are wrong. Let me prove you wrong. Here we are. I'm not a fan of the AI voice. I'd rather you just do the Zully the Witch thing and just have text on the screen. But that's a me thing. This guy is something else, Andrew. Undead Crypt is a joke. I didn't discover the shortcut before Mauler missed the start of the stream. Is this person attacking him? Pretty much. This is supposed to be a long playlist of videos responding to Mauler's response to H-Bomber Guy's reaction to Matthew Matos's critique of Dark Souls 2. We're layering this on thick today. So let's go back at the beginning of this section and then start.
Is already.
Let's go back a little bit. Just going to show a point. It also seems like these sections aren't really going to feed into each other. They just kind of move into different area with same problem. So I'm a little confused here.
Saying there are single enemy encounters that results in you making movements that are completely casual and natural that result in triggering more ambushes that result in a huge amount of enemies causing a spam bush.
See, that area is a particularly egregious example of that because there are several enemies that spawn and there are unlimited undead that will get up, literally rise out of the ground over and over to hit a bell which summons the tough enemies. They do this throughout this area in multiple locations, right? This is a problem for this area specifically that is more unique than the others, but it is absolutely one of those things that the developers have crammed this area full of things that will try to ruin your run by putting a bunch of obstacles in the way and then having tons of enemies that can spawn on top of enemies that can, essentially float through these things. So let's see what the quote unquote defense of this is.
You making movements that are completely casual and natural that result in triggering more ambushes that result in a huge amount of enemies causing a spam bush.
At that point, the game has already taught him several times that these rooms that are filled with graves and bells are dangerous, and that you need to prevent the hollows from hitting the bells. To me, this is an interesting mechanic.
This is one thing, right? This guy's a Chad. Mauler was biased, which is fair given how bad H-Bomber Guy video was. This is one thing. The thing that I'm already picking up from this video is that one thing that I've seen across a lot of people that sort of defend Dark Souls 2, or not a lot of people that defend Dark Souls 2 necessarily, but a big defense that a lot of people bring up when defending Dark Souls 2 is you're playing the game wrong, right? Which I think is one thing that is an incredibly vague thing to say. But I think what happens a lot of the time is people play the game and they play it in a sort of natural way where they try to deal with things as they come, right? And I think that one of the biggest problems with Dark Souls 2 is that it becomes either the hardest Dark Souls game or the easiest Dark Souls game once you understand the mechanics of it, right? And I think that is inherently where a lot of people splits along the lines of it being the best game or the worst game of the trilogy, right? I think that, excuse me, I think that there is a significant difference between when this game effectively kills you versus when you cheese the game, right? Or you effectively outmaneuver the game, right? Cheese is a bad word. Ignore I said that. That's not the right word. But one thing that is very clear with Dark Souls 2 is that a lot of the encounters are built on the player's lack of knowledge, right? Like the bells in this situation are definitely one of them, right? If you're just running around trying to make it around the area and then the hollows hit the bell, you're going to get spam bushed by a lot of tough enemies in a particular area. That is going to happen, right? But if you're aware of that, you will kill the little guys or do your best to run through the area and ignore them, which is totally possible, right? But the inherent problem isn't the player's response to the bullshit, it's that the bullshit is there in the first place. That is the biggest problem, is that you have created an encounter with enemies that will respawn continuously, the little zombie dudes, that will summon ghost dudes through the bells until the bells are destroyed, right? You have created an encounter that already has spam elements, and then you put the player in a situation where there are tons of little pillars of rock everywhere that are going to restrict their movement even more so than normal, given that they're fighting multiple enemies that can spawn, right? It's that thing where you are mixing in the initial difficult encounter in such a one-dimensional way that every follow-up playthrough is going to have players doing like a handful of things to deal with the encounter that makes it much easier, right? It's one of those things where the encounters are not consistent from playthrough to playthrough because you understand where the bullshit lies. You understand where the spam bush is coming from, so you take out the bells, you take out the little statues that summon the dudes, right? You use whatever weapons available to deal with all the different crap in the area that restricts your movement, that summons extra enemies, and you try to deal with the little guys as fast as possible. And the game even catches you out sometimes on that by continuously spawning them. I personally had it happen to me in this area during the final sort of boss run, towards Velstadt, where you have that long corridor with an area that can summon a bunch of the dudes, and my thing with that area was in the base game there was one little zombie under the staircase with a bell, right? I went down there, killed him, moved on, thought I was done. In the Scholar, I did that. Another zombie spawned and rung the bell after I had killed the previous one and had left the area. They are desperate to spam bush you in this area. All right, this is one of the worst cases of it, right? Just because there are ways around it does not mean that it is fair, does not mean that it is engaging, and does not mean it is not a spam bush. All right, this is a criticism that this is a point that a lot of people put in defense of a lot of bad mechanics throughout this entire From Software catalog, right? This is not just restrictive to Dark Souls 2. Is just because there is a way around it does not mean that it is always fair, does not mean that it is always intuitive, and does not mean that it isn't always a problem, right? This is the thing where the problem is at the baseline. You have enemies that spawn continuously that will activate devices around the area that the player will have trouble getting to, that will spawn more enemies that can negate the stuff that restricts the player's movement and can gank you because they spawn several enemies at once. It is an encounter that I think perfectly displays the problem with the design philosophy of Dark Souls 2, which is ultimately the underlying issue, right? An ambush isn't necessarily going to be bad in this series, right? A group of enemies isn't necessarily going to be bad in this series or in this particular game. The problem is that they continue to do the same dynamic over and over of lure the player into an area with an enemy, have multiple enemies be activated in some way, whether summoned through a device, whether them hanging onto a cliff that they climb up, or wherever, right? But the main problem with a lot of these encounters is we don't know how to make the fight multidimensional beyond having multiple enemies in a tight space with the player's movement being restricted, as well as just hammering them with lots of enemies at once. This is one of those areas that does it. Just because there's a way around it by destroying the bells does not undo the fact that the problem is still there. The big area with tons of enemies that can be summoned at once without really any player involvement is the problem. The player's reaction to it is not necessarily the root cause of the problem, right? This isn't a skill issue. This is they've created a giant area that is built to spam bush you. And this happens throughout the game in multiple locations, right? And this is one thing that I need to lay down sort of now, because I don't want to repeat myself if this is the exact same content over and over and over and over throughout this video, right? There are certain situations where having multiple groups of or multiple enemies in a group is very manageable, right? This is one thing that also depends on build, right? For example, I typically play Dark Souls 2 in a glass cannon build, right, with the Ultra Greatsword. That thing is fantastic for dealing with this area because it has a very wide reach, is able to destroy the rocks in one hit, and can destroy the bell in, I think, 3 hits. I haven't played Dark Souls 2 in a while, so I need to refresh. But the short version is certain weapons are very effective with this area, right? But that still doesn't undo the fact that you have a tight space with several objects in the way, with enemies that can activate more enemies that are more aggressive and can get around the restrictions of the area, right? Just because I can deal with it doesn't mean the encounter is a good encounter to begin with and isn't going to lead to problems with people that don't have a specific build built to deal with that kind of stuff. Again, just because there's a way out doesn't mean that it's a good encounter. All right, I need to catch up on chat because I was ranting for like 5 minutes. What a turd. Mauler critique DS2, but he's also positive on playing it. This is one thing, I enjoy playing it, and I think there's a lot of good things in Dark Souls 2. I just think it needed to be refined. You know, I think the biggest issue with Dark Souls 2 is that the design philosophy of it is too focused on difficulty rather than fairness. I think that leads to a lot of these encounters where they just do the same thing over and over with multiple enemies. I've never done the PvP, but it's regularly been said to have the best PvP from every Souls content creator. I've heard that a lot, but I don't care about PvP, so that's just me. All right. All right. I really hope he's not one of those guys that just goes on the defense for every single area. Frigid outskirts defense is bad omen. A bad omen. Yeah. Well, it's one of those things, right? If I were to defend Dark Souls 1 from criticisms, right, I would still go after Bed of Chaos as the worst boss in the game, because it is the worst boss in the game, right? There's no defending that kind of content, right? Like there are some things that are just inherently bad given this series mechanics and given the series sort of design philosophies, right? There are some things that are just bad throughout all of these games, right? It's just a thing where people have an irrational love and an irrational hate towards several games in this series. And that's a big problem. And I mean that across the board, right? There are people that irrationally love and hate Dark Souls 1, love and hate Dark Souls 2, love and hate Dark Souls 3, right? There are people all across that trilogy and the entire community of this From Software, whatever it is, that just have an absurd sort of passion for things where they have to defend every single aspect or they have to praise every single aspect. And it's one of those things that just makes the conversation really annoying when I'm trying to discuss something that I think is mechanically problematic, and then people say that I'm just not good at the game, get good, or they just say that I'm playing the game wrong. It's like, no, I'm talking about a problem that's in the game, right? And I've explained how you deal with it, right? I've explained what the problem is, right? You are building encounters with multiple enemies when this game is in its best situation a 1 versus 1, right? You're playing against the series' strengths when you make spam encounters like this, especially when you make them sort of sudden openings to multiple people spawning. Right. Been replaying DS2, Skull of the First Sin, and enjoyed my time even with its faults. That's the thing too. I still enjoy playing the game. You know, people. Another thing is just people. People. What's the word? People treat criticism as hate and vice versa, and that needs to stop. Okay, like I love playing Dark Souls 2, but I have a lot of criticisms of Dark Souls 2. Right? They are not the same. Right? Hating something is not the same as criticizing it, and people need to we need to all get on the same page as that. You know, criticism is not hate, and hate is not criticism. I enjoy it as well when I'm more of a patient and deliberate mood. Just can't stand when people overly defend it. Elden Ring basically ruined the fact that From Software games were meant to be hard but fair. Yeah, Elden Ring took a lot of the wrong lessons from the Dark Souls trilogy. You can only critique what you have. Yeah. It completely shattered it, and people eat up Elden Ring's difficulty. Yeah, it hurts my soul, man. Elden Ring got more critique because it was a suffering Souls game. It was a really good game, but it wasn't the best in the Souls series. That's why it got more critiques. Yeah, and I think that's pretty fair. Well, I think it's also a thing where it is a follow up to what could be considered two banger games, right? Like Demon Souls and Dark Souls 1 are both fantastic games. So when the game So when Dark Souls 2 comes out and has a lot of problems that were not inherent in the previous games, it pretty much deserves the criticism it gets. Maybe not all of it. And this is one thing too. Like Mauler and people in sort of his crew have always said that Dark Souls 2 was one of the worst games they ever played. I completely disagree. I don't think it's the worst game ever made. I don't think it's the worst game ever made in this sort of style. I don't even really think it's the worst Souls game, right? All things considered, right? I'd have to take a long time to think about it, but I don't think it is the worst Souls game, right? But in terms of the Dark Souls trilogy, it is definitely the worst Dark Souls game because it has a lot of mechanical problems that it does not continue systems from the previous game like a sequel should. It doesn't expand a lot upon a lot of things like Dark Souls 3 did, and it also has a lot of problems with focusing so much on difficulty as opposed to fairness, and also just having the same types of encounters over and over and over, where you just throw a bunch of enemies at the player, throw a bunch of enemies at the player, throw a bunch of enemies at the player, throw a bunch of enemies with high damage, high health, and high poise damage at the player. It's just the same difficulty all the time. And that's why the game gets kind of monotonous after replaying it. It's just that it's that thing where just they keep on doing the same shit over and over. And it bogs down the overall experience when you have what's arguably the same encounter, 100 times in the game. Not every single encounter is like that, but a lot of the encounters are, right? And it's the thing that drags down the overall experience. Also, thinking a game is bad is different than how much you like it. That's the difference between objectivity and subjectivity. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, Vangarish, you're blowing up 8 views. Oh man, new record. I think this might actually be a new record. That's more than I've got ever got. Lol. DS2's controls are clunky, bosses are samey, and hitboxes are awful. Yeah, it's just there's a lot of technical issues with Dark Souls 2. And this is one thing, right? Like I've often said that. Well, let me bring up two things, then we'll get back to the video. One thing I've said for a while is if Dark Souls 2 was the first game in this sort of Souls-like series, I could give it a pass for a lot of these mechanical problems, right? It would be the first of its kind in that situation, right? But because it's the third game in this series, and it's had two previous examples that got a lot right, the stumblings in this game are way worse than if this was a first game in a series, right? Because they got this shit right previously over the course of two games, right? That proves that this was not just lightning in a bottle with Demon Souls or Dark Souls, right? They got this right twice. So for them to get a lot of this stuff wrong in Dark Souls 2, when it comes to hitboxes being bad, dodge rolling being affected by a stat, which is nowhere close to anything in the previous games, it's one of those things where they just dropped the ball on so many things when developing this particular game that it deserves the criticism it gets because of that, right? It is a subpar mechanical system than the previous games had. And this is one thing, this is my second point. I think that Dark Souls 2 could have been a great game if the A team was in charge of it and they focused up efforts, right? I think splitting the production of this game along with Bloodborne really hurt both games, right? I have significant problems with Bloodborne, right? But I think them splitting their focus from between this game and Bloodborne, I think damaged both games, right? And personally, if we had a Dark Souls 2 with some of the content in here, but revamped by the sort of classic team, I think this game would have been amazing, right? Just like Dark Souls 1 and just like Demon Souls, right? I think the problem is that they just didn't have the same sort of um, skill set as the teams that made the original two games, right? Because the production was split, and it's one of those things that I think really does hinder this series as it goes on. But now I'm at the point where I think the A team is also having problems. So we've sort of come full circle where I don't want either team working on any more of these games. But it's just one of those things where I think at the time this game was screwed based on the production shift and by just the over reliance on difficulty through any means necessary. And I think that's one of the biggest problems with this game is just it was built from the ground up in a subpar way to begin with. All right, I need to catch up on chat before I move on. Where was I at? Here we go. It was one of the weakest games in the Dark Souls series, but I wouldn't consider it a bad game at all. I'd agree with that. I would say that there are unfair situations in every FromSoft game, no matter how many times people said hard but fair. That's the thing. I would agree with that. I think there are plenty of encounters in each game that are very unfair. I think the problem with Dark Souls 2 is that a lot of it's the same type of difficult but fair thing, and it's very monotonous because they do the same thing over and over. I think Elden Ring is slightly better in that regard because a lot of the difficulty in Elden Ring is sort of different, but it's still problematic given the way that mechanics work in that game. So I'm not defending From Software and saying this is like the black sheep or anything like that, right? I think that From Software has learned the wrong lessons from a lot of these games over time, and I think Dark Souls 2 was sort of the beginning of a lot of bad ideas being introduced. I'm going to disagree considering it did introduce things that carried over DS3, but sadly other things tanked. Yeah, well, I mean, like Dark Souls 2 was basically a giant experiment pile, and I think there's a lot of stuff in there that could have worked if they refined it more. And again, it's one of those things where because they split the production of between this and Bloodborne, I feel like both games were negatively. I feel like both games would have been better if they focused on Bloodborne, finished that up, and then made Dark Souls 2. Because I feel like that would have made Dark Souls 2 better, and that also would have made Dark Souls 3 even better than what Dark Souls 3 is now. I think it would have been a better way to focus their efforts and resources.
Noob made this game. They were like, how do we make this game more difficult? I don't know what we can do with the AI to make it more difficult, but we could just put a ton in there. That will definitely make things harder.
If you come across a hole in the ground that has the exact same graves visible from above, you should already mentally prepare for what will await you. The game gives you plenty of time to assess the situation, and it is now up to you as the player to figure out what to do now, which is obviously to cautiously take care of the graves while paying attention to hollows sneaking up on the bell. It is a tense situation with an interesting mechanic that only rarely turns into enemy spam, but they seem to have missed how the AI is scripted here.
They seem to have missed how the AI is scripted here. What, like to appear and go for you? It's also one of the things too, like when you show like altered video game footage of the game, it makes me think that you're just cheating shit in. Right? Like it's one thing where the fact that this guy is making all this footage on his own end with obvious sort of like editors in place, like being able to de-aggro enemies and like basically using cheats and stuff. You're not helping your argument when it looks like you're using cheats to make the encounter look different, right? Like as we were dealing with the Frigid Outskirts stuff, you need to show the game in its most normal state. And this is one thing that I think is missed in this sort of last little section, right, is that when you look at the whole, right, you are coming out of an area that has had the same problem with several enemies, right? And this is a very common thing in this game that people say is people playing bad, but it's also a thing where when you throw a bunch of enemies at the player at a specific point, if they choose to run away, they can run away in the wrong direction, right? And that can cause that can compound the issue, right? This isn't necessarily a skill issue as it is if you don't know what's coming, then you're just going to deal with more bullshit, right? In this situation, yeah, be prepared for more people to spawn when you get down there, and I think this is a thing where I understand the criticism of this area overall, and I understand the rebuttal of it. And I think there is a decent argument to be made with this area that, you can sort of control the situation more so than in other sort of spam bush areas. But at the same time, it still has that problem of, it can break down into a spam bush pretty quickly. Because one thing I've found is it's never taken these guys this long to ring the bell upon me dropping down like it does for him here.
The exact same graves visible from above you should already mentally prepare for what will await you. The game gives you plenty of time to assess the situation, and it is now up to you as the player to figure out what to do now, which is obviously to cautiously take care of the graves while paying attention to hollows sneaking up on the bell. It is a
See, this is one thing is every time that I've played through this area, as soon as I've gone down there, there are already undead up spawned moving towards a bell. Right? I don't know what is going on with his game here where they're just taking their sweet time. Right? I've never seen them take their time in this area. Right? And this is part of the thing. Because my experience doesn't line up with yours, and because I don't see your HUD, and because I've seen you using cheats in the previous section, I don't trust your footage. This isn't even really about refuting Mauler's points anymore at this point. This is just me going, I don't know if I can trust your footage because you've shown that you have cheats. You've shown that you will use them. And so I can't tell which footage is natural versus which footage is altered. Which gameplay is natural versus which footage is altered. Right? I don't get it. I can't tell the difference sometimes because it's not very clear. Right? This also doesn't match up with any of the experiences I've had in this area. Now, this is one thing. He might be playing Scholar. I've only played through Scholar once. But I've played through the base game of Dark Souls 2 for about 1,000 hours. All right? I've dealt with this situation. And it's very rarely have I ever come down here and had enough time to break down everything. Mainly because I run away from the area. Just because you can drop down and run away and just circumvent this whole shit. Oh my god. He really is about to glaze everything, isn't he? Why is this clown using the fact that Mauler is showing his friends play the game? I don't quite get it. I think he's just going for, look at his friends. They don't get the encounter sort of a thing. Please, gods above, don't let it be. Let Domo be like a Borin, please. That's like me saying you suck at Dark Souls, then showing content from some random person. I mean, Mauler used the footage to illustrate some points, so I think it is kind of fair to respond to that footage, 1,000 hours? Damn, Vangaris, you have more than me. I mean, Dark Souls 2 is the most played game in the Dark Souls trilogy for me. That's largely just because I did a series where I ground out to max level, so that's, it was like, I mean, to say that I've got experience with the game is to put it mildly, okay?
tense situation with an interesting mechanic that only rarely turns into enemy spam, but they seem to have missed how the AI is scripted here.
What? Oh my god, are you kidding me? Oh, this game, man.
This whole unwittingly exploring or running away from current enemies leading to these spam bushes happens so often that you can't not spot the pattern.
Damn, for enemies, that looks scary. But if you actually try to fight this encounter, it isn't scary, as it isn't just mindless enemy spam, but once again a group of enemies with a very interesting mechanic. They stay far away from you, together as a group. You can walk.
So, wow, they stay far away as a group. Literally in the other footage, they were following him. It's like, dude, have you looked at the footage you're criticizing? I still need to get my other Souls characters to max level. It's not worth it, really, unless you just really want to do it. It's such a grind. Yes, it is, bro. It is literally mindless enemy spamming. Well, this is one thing. If they just had one invader appear and then adjusted the health accordingly, that would be one thing, right? But because they summoned a group of them, just the design philosophy persisting through of put as many enemies in the encounter as possible, make the player suffer. Just, put as many enemies involved, make it as big of a clusterfuck as you can. You drop 4 red phantoms who have a noticeably large health pool to deal with. Now, I think these guys don't actually have that much health by comparison to the regular phantoms, but it is still a problem when you have this many of them on top of range damage. Plus, you have no idea that these enemies have lower health, right? You have no idea of that until you actually hit them. So this is one of those This is one of those weird things where the AI is acting different in his footage versus the other footage, and it's one of those things where it's like, okay, the AI may have options, but that doesn't excuse the fact that you still spawn several invaders in the same spot, right? Like that's still a problem. You're still doing the spam, right? This isn't a counter to the spam because it's easy. You're still doing the spam. Why does his voice sound that way? Is he using a computer-generated voice? He is. Yeah. He's one of them AI people, or one of those AI voices.
Walk up to them to invite one of them to fight you. This is not unfair enemy spam. This is just a gimmick fight where you have to dodge arrows while dealing with relatively easy enemies one-on-one. It is a fair challenge that can also be trivialized by using a shield. And I also like how it feels like being hunted down by a group of predators. To be fair, that was a close call, but you get the point that it would have been much easier if he had just tried to engage with the fight. And even if you do run away, it is still a lot less gankier than he makes it out to be. Like, pay attention to the second one. He waits for the first one to drop out of the battle before he joins, but then they just slowly walk back to the stairs.
Does he really think this is an own? You're just proving that the AI is stupid. That they're running away from you. That they can run away from you. It's like this isn't an own against the spam. Like they're still going to try to peck you, especially when you're standing there just blocking with a shield for some reason. Okay, so you're literally exploiting the AI now. Yeah, pretty much. I mean, this is one thing about going through this area on my runs with like a glass cannon build is I will usually just tank as much as I can and just beat them down as fast as possible with the greatsword because you can do it, right? But it's one of those things where you're still dealing with a spam bush, right? A lot of enemies that can group up on you. Just because he has footage to the contrary doesn't negate the fact that Fortia's footage does include them coming after him right back to the entryway, right?
From current enemies leading
Like,
to
look
the
at that. They're all over here. Just because your footage is different doesn't mean it can't still happen.
Group of predators.
Again, this is the thing is like you are not watching your footage, not paying attention to what the footage you are showing and critiquing is saying.
To be fair, that was a close call, but you get the point that it would have been much easier if he had just tried to engage with the fight. And even if you do run away, it is still a lot less gankier than he makes it out to be. Like, pay attention to the second one. He waits for the first one to drop out of the battle before he joins, but then they just slowly walk back to the stairs. The AI is scripted to allow you to fight them 1 versus 1, so I think it just reeks of bias to call it an unfair spam bush. In my opinion, it is one of the better designed and most memorable mini-bosses in the series.
One of the better designed mini bosses in the series, as he shows the AI fumbling over attacking the player. That is, oh man. This is why Elden Ring got the reception it did. This is part of the problem. Just, this is the best content in the series as the AI fumbles to move forward or backward or do anything besides collide with each other. Well, let's go back and watch this, right? Let's go back and watch this group.
The AI is scripted to allow you to fight them 1 versus 1, so I think it just reeks of bias to call it an unfair spam bush. In my opinion, it is one of the better designed and most memorable mini-bosses in the series.
I mean, just look at that. The AI are just standing there. They're just standing there for half of this encounter. Why would you say this is one of the more memorable ones? Why? Honestly, I get why you don't trust Domo, but I don't trust Mauler footage either. I expect he went running everywhere in the level and go back at the beginning and say, wow, there are so many. I mean, I think that there is well, again, going back to what I said, Dark Souls 2 has a thing where it punishes you for exploring, right? And if you explore naturally, you will run into situations that are very problematic. On your following playthroughs, you will know where the shit is. So that'll make it a lot easier. But it's still that problem of if you're running certain places, you're going to run into issues. And this is one thing too, like everybody plays games differently, right? There's hardly a single way that everyone needs to play a game, right? It's just one of those things where I think that I think the problem with this stuff is that it's one of those things where the title sort of betrays the intention, right? Saying unfair enemy spam or skill issue, he's implying that the people that played the game and dealt with the spam and complained about it aren't good at the game. While that can certainly be a thing for several players who weren't good at the game and just couldn't deal with the groups of enemies, it's still a problem when you have just groups of enemies just appearing out of nowhere just to fight you. The problem is still there. The problem is the spam, right? Because at the end of the day, it's just the same encounter over and over and over. It's just the enemies might be slightly tweaked. It's not just the actual encounter, it's the principle behind it that is also the problem. I can understand that. I'm trying to remain unbiased so far, but defending even these types of encounters is definitely not inspiring confidence. Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things too, like with him praising this encounter while the AI fumbles in the background is not a good look.
I mean, seriously, does this look like mindless enemy spam to you? There's 3 enemies around me and only ever one of them does something.
Oh my god, 5 enemies against me. So fun. Jesus Christ. The more the better, right? This is Dark Souls. This is supposed to be a hard game. How do we spice things up from Dark Souls 1? Yeah, let's just throw a load of enemies everywhere.
I also disagree.
All right, I know what he's going to say about this. He's like, did you know that you can get summons that help you in this fight? Did you know that there are NPCs you unlock around the map to help deal with this fight? It's one of those things where it's like he's going to use the most obvious things of, hey, this is a skill issue. It's like, no, this is not a skill issue. The boss unlocks right here, right in front of you. You don't know that the NPCs and the snow dudes are available. Right? This is not a skill issue. This is the game is leading you into an encounter where you are going to get fucked because you don't have knowledge of something that you have not been hinted at towards. Right? This is the biggest, I'd say this is probably the biggest problem with Dark Souls 2 is once you understand the mechanics of Dark Souls 2 and its encounters, the game is blitzable as hell, right? This game becomes super easy once you understand the most basic shit about the designs of different encounters. The most basic shit. That's one reason why I have fun with the game is because it's so easy to blitz the game, right? But this is also one thing why I consider this game to either be the hardest or the easiest from Dark Souls game because it's all based on what you know, right? Like once you know how the mechanics work, you will have a much better second run than you do the first run, right? And that's pretty typical for most of these games, right? But the difference between your first run, where you will die to all kinds of ambushes, all kinds of cheap stuff, all kinds of encounters where the developers let you go into the encounter, but don't tell you that that's the worst way to do the encounter. That's part of the problem, is the game keeps throwing encounters at you where you are going to suck at it because you don't have knowledge that comes from other stuff later on. And this is a great example of that. This is one thing too. I don't even mind the fact that you have several enemies in this boss fight, right? Like I think it's actually a neat gimmick. I think it needed to be tweaked a little bit because Fortia jumping in immediately is like, I mean, why wouldn't you jump in at this point? I mean, if the boss is right there, why wouldn't you? But it is one of those things where it's just like, it's the same old tired shit of just because players didn't know something doesn't mean that their play style was wrong or that they should or this should be called a skill issue. This is not a skill issue. This is a knowledge issue where players just don't know how stuff works yet. You can't blame people for not knowing how shit works. Oh boy. True, I play very slowly and cautiously, so that might be why I like DS2 so much, plus being my first Souls game. I mean, it was also my first Souls game, and it's one of those things where playing cautiously is definitely advisable for all the games. But I feel like Dark Souls 2 helps to it really pushes that probably a little farther than the other games do. If he defends this encounter, I may have to close my heart to him. I can make an entire rant about the Ivory King gank fight. It's not good. Also, yeah, I play that way too when I play DS2. That's why I need to be in a certain mood, because I do enjoy using a lightning bow. I think DS2 is the easiest by a country mile. Life gems alone trivialize the difficulty. I would agree with that. Then add the overly simple boss attack patterns, and it makes for the Souls game that I die the least in. Yeah. Yeah, it's one of those things where Mauler actually brought this up in, I forget which video in his series he did, but he brought up a really good point where if you play the game where you go to Force of the Fallen Giants first, complete that area, get the hag to relocate to Majula, and then you spend your levels evenly between all your stats and any remaining souls each time you put into life gems, the game will usually have a hard time killing you, except in extreme circumstances. And that's pretty true. Like if you start the game off where you like if you're going for a glass cannon build, for example, right? If you start off, get all your points into ADP to get an adequate amount of iframes, and then you complete Force of the Fallen Giants, and you get the hag to relocate, all the levels you really need to get are for health, stamina, and strength. Other than that, you don't really need any more levels. So, like, you can put stuff in the game, or you can put stuff in your build as you go, and every overabundance of souls will go to life gems. You'll probably have a hard time dying unless you're just uniquely terrible at the game. But again, this comes from knowledge. This isn't the base game experience, right? This comes from knowing how the game works. This is one thing where I feel like the first time encounter for Dark Souls 2 players is a lot rougher than subsequent runs.
Agree with the assessment that this spectacular battle between two small armies is just mindless enemy spam for the sake of artificial difficulty. It's a glorious battle with a great atmosphere. Throughout the whole fight, your army usually has more soldiers than his does. I'm using the same weapon as he did, but with relatively low strength and not even any damage boosting rings, and yet I still have no issue defeating them faster than they spawn. But unlike him, I explored the whole area to gather all the knights.
And the knights?
I mean, again, he's missing the entire point of it. It's like you're still dealing with a cluster of enemies. Just because you have another cluster of friends to help you out doesn't change the fact that they have just made an encounter with a cluster of enemies. Right? You have all this shit leading up to the boss, which I think would have been better if they locked the boss off until after you unlocked all these enemies, or all the friends that you can get in this fight. Right? I think this encounter on its own, as early as possible, is utterly dog shit. Now later, I think it's good because I think it works as intended, but they clearly wanted players to go in there and die and realize that they sucked at it until they got friends from other places in the DLC. It's just one of those things where just Domo seems to be missing the point of what Mauler's video is going for and what these clips are going for. It seems like he's missing the point and just nitpicking skill issue. Right? Because skill issue is often the biggest defense these people have. It's like, oh, they weren't good at the game. It's like, well, I can't really get good at the game if it continues to ambush me with a ambusher that can insta-kill me with a backstab. Right? Like in the Burnt Ivory King DLC. Right? It's one of those things where just this is not a thing of the encounters are terrible. Once you get good, you will realize how terrible they are because they are often very much the same. The AI for the Ivory King bad is bad in my opinion. The enemy knights hyperfixate on you even in the middle of your knights. Yeah, well, this is one thing too. The series has had a really bad management of aggro between AI. It's been very inconsistent across all the games, and it's just not. The series is not good at it. Just for lack of a better word, just this developer is not good at making multiple AI account for multiple enemy AI. It just gets really clusterfucky. I end up getting attacked so many times because some pyromancer that spawned in across the arena is programmed to attack me first. Yeah, again, it's just really just all over the place with the AI and who they choose to attack. Also, there is no checkpoints. You would have to do this 5-minute long encounter every time. Yeah, that's also a thing. It's like a mandatory boss sort of run is going to lead to issues on retrying. Man, I remember farming those burnt soldier for hours just for talking to an NPC and a sword that can heal your co-op bro if you hit it with them. Oh man.
Are actually aggressive and they hit hard. So it's not like some bull knights that you can just one shot. It's actually like decent knights.
I also wouldn't categorize them as being especially hard-hitting, as you can take so many hits of them. Oh sorry, that's only true for me as I'm wearing armor instead of running around naked and then complaining that enemies do too much damage. Is he really surprised that his glass cannon build is made out of glass? In my tests I took like 50% extra damage when I removed all my armor and rings.
But the issue here is that it applies to basically every scenario in the series. There are always things that can change the benefits and punishments of the situations. At the end there, he says that this is better than simply knowing when to dodge in fights against more manageable enemies. Is this a defense for spam?
Without context, his clip really does look like enemy spam. But people that played this game will realize that this situation happens if you run past enemies instead of fighting your way through the level. Since the beginning of this area, the game has taught you to pay attention to enemies hanging from ledges. So, when you come here to open up the shortcut, you will notice the enemies that followed him up to the ship. These enemies do not matter for the run back, but if you want to explore the ship, you should fight your way through the area instead of just rushing past enemies, and then acting surprised that they followed you. This is once again a situation that could have been prevented by just playing normal and paying attention.
Which will give
Man, again, it's that same thing where it's just like it's just that thing where it's just this is all coming back to the players don't know about this stuff sometimes. Again, this is getting boring reiterating this just over and over. Is the spam bush is still there. The ambushes are still there. Right? You're doing the same encounter over and 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 over. That is still a problem. Right? Just because people don't know about it doesn't mean that it's still not a problem. I'm getting brain fried just listening to the same point being made over and over and over. And then the counter argument is also the same over and over and over. I never did it, but I heard the grind was quite hell. It is. Grinding in all these games is hell. It is, even with 4 nights helping. I'm not going to fight my way through 100 enemies, man. LeMayo, I'm sorry. I have time to waste, but I'm not going to waste it to that extent. I'd imagine the sword sounds like a cool roleplay build, though. Oh, man. It's one of those things where, like, if he just makes the same points over and over and over, I'm probably just going to say repeat my point from X minutes ago and then move on, because I don't want to have to deal with this, same point over and over and over.
players very specific experiences.
Oh yeah, the demon ghosts. Off.
What are they?
Oh my god. No, the horse. No, why are there 5 million enemies? Oh.
Yeah, that is indeed a very specific experience. For me, this unfair spam on a tight platform does not happen, because I fight enemies instead of just walking past them and then acting surprised that they followed me. There is a really simple solution to so many of their problems. If you want to slowly explore an area, just don't walk past enemies. Deal with them in smaller groups instead of luring them all together to a small platform. Especially as these are weak hollows that only become a problem if you decide to fight a whole group of them.
Anyway,
I like how it completely negates the fact that a lot of those enemies have the dark imbued weapons that deal a crazy amount of damage for how early in the game they are. On top of not taking the same path as Fortia, I might add, he didn't go up the ladder where the ambusher was. that was on the ladder that knocked him down. It's also one of the things too, like he is specifically showing the ambush clips, but not showing the lead up to the ambush clips, where you could probably easily miss the enemies. Right? And again, this is one of those things where the more knowledge you have of the ambushes, the more you're going to spend time dealing with them, because you know that the game is going to throw a bunch of enemies with low health but very high, like, damaging knives at you. Right? Again, it's just same point over again. This is not a skill issue. This is a knowledge issue of when the bullshit's about to happen. See, it can be if you try to be like the healer of the RPG party. Try that in Elden Ring. It's somewhat fun. I should try it in the other Souls games too. He literally breezes past it by saying, "Huh, doesn't happen to me. I beat all the enemies, so they can't demonstrate the lack of leashing." Yeah, it's just, man. Your Honor, I would move to repeat the same defense arguments as before. It's just getting old.
All of this is what Mathematosis was talking about. These games aren't built for this. This is the kind of combat that has you herding your enemies.
This might not be as intuitive, but if you want to immerse yourself in a game, you should make use of basic gameplay mechanics. The first time you encounter spiders is in a dark cave, where you are encouraged to use the torch in order to see something, which will soon teach you that spiders are afraid of the torch, at least in the improved Scholar Edition. This whole area in general.
Yeah, let's forget that most people don't want to use a torch because it completely gets rid of the other arm and everything that comes with it, whether it be a spell casting opportunity, a shield, another weapon, two-handing weapon. Let's completely forsake all these builds so we can light a little match. Woo.
Has lots of dark caves with spiders. And the same is true for this room as well. It is relatively dark and there's a sconce that encourages you to light it on fire. You can choose between giving up your left hand in exchange of not having to deal with a bunch of weak spiders.
Absolutely fascinating. I love that editing gives me this kind of power where I can just be like, hey, you said this, and then you said this.
These spiders are not unfair enemy spam. Instead, they represent the choice of two-handing your weapon to fight against a bunch of spiders in the dark, or of using the torch for a fun cave exploring atmosphere. There are also a lot of sconces spread throughout this area, which make it easier to light up your torch again after a fight without having to go back to the bonfire or using a butterfly. I'm just thinking that they would have had a much better experience if they interacted more with the environment.
This is an experience that does indeed happen in Dark Souls 1, but they are very few and very far between. I imagine this was the choice because being approached by hordes of spam isn't something people generally enjoy in Dark Souls. Plenty do, but for the most part it means that you will need to find a bottleneck and begin hacking away at them over and over again. All the clips you've been seeing are from Fortia's first playthrough, and seeing his approach combined with his reactions to areas that are horrendously built is always so bloody cathartic.
Always? Think so. And I'm getting invaded? What, you didn't think I had enough trouble with all of this? Come on, game.
For this encounter, you could just invite him back into the bonfire room, in order to deal with him alone without having to care about the mages outside.
Did Fortia even have the area unlocked? Because it's very easy to come down to the spot without unlocking the bonfire. I can somewhat give him a pass on this. I personally like the torch mechanic, but you do know people two-hand their weapon, right? Or use anything else. Those naked hollows with the dark weapons do a ton of damage indeed. It's like a crazy hobo trying to stab you with a dirty syringe with who knows how many diseases. Yes. Or if you use a shield, this Lameo, those dudes smite your HP bar. Yeah, this is one of the things like this. You're just overclocking the difficulty by just spamming a bunch of different enemies into this area. Like an invasion here would have been fine, right? The mages here would have been fine. The spiders here would have been fine. When you add all of them here, you're just making everything a bigger clusterfuck every time you keep adding more enemies to the fray.
Think so.
Like, look at all that.
And I'm getting invaded? What, you didn't think I had enough trouble with all of this? Come on, game.
For this encounter, you could just invite him back into the bonfire room in order to deal with him alone without having to care about the mages outside. Or
Archers in the previous games cover a huge amount of encounters, but the very first one you're likely to encounter in a set-piece-like scenario offers the chance of taking it out first or last, depending on your preference, and this is in many points of the game, as well as moments in which you are far more benefited to recognize that they should be taken out first to make the encounter easier, which is actually variety to reward the player for recognizing a beneficial path over another feasible, yet less profitable path. That, in a nutshell, is From Software gameplay. Going all the way back to choosing when the best time to heal is, you have to recognize your environment and work with it. I mean, some players may or may not have learned it, every player is different, but perhaps you would this time around. This isn't just a tedious killing of the archers for no other reason than being forceful, they want you to appreciate your surroundings. At the end, he then says you have to deal with them while they are shooting at you in the fight, or before the fight, which, yes, that's how it works in every From Software game. I really don't see the purpose of this argument since it would be so hard to prove definitively, and even if it were true, it's barely anything substantial because there is an argument for the value of constructed scenarios for combat. Besides, nothing in terms of variety ever happens with swarms aside from killing them all in environmental traps, which is very, very rare. Other than that, you run, you slash, you repeat.
I'm pretty sure that he considers
This is just one of those things where it's just like he's trying to do the own of putting the footage of his own playthrough, proving his point, along with the point that Mauler was making when it's like, dude, you're completely ignoring that there is still a massive clusterfuck in that encounter. It's just, I swear that a lot of people that love just fanatically defending Dark Souls 2 just have like Dark Souls 2 vision goggles on where they see anything Dark Souls 2 doing is good. And they just cannot see people's arguments about why it could be problematic. It's just hurting my soul. Does Dark Souls have an arachnophobe mode? I don't think so. Although there technically aren't that many spiders in the game. I mean, there's only like, what, like 2 enemies that would count? I wish. Again, it's just that thing of just, Dark Souls 1 never had this level of a clusterfuck between multiple casters spamming spells at you on top of enemies popping out of the ground, on top of enemies that give you a gas that can kill you if it builds up high enough on top of an invader, right? Dark Souls 1 never did that, right? Dark Souls 1 never did that. You just drop down there and you're in that situation.
it to be rare, because he rarely paid attention to the environment.
Here we go, talking about environmental traps.
Very, very rare. Other than that, you run, you slash, you repeat.
I'm pretty sure that he considers it to be rare, because he rarely paid attention to the environment. There's so many situations that he presents as mindless spam that would have had smarter solutions. Like this one.
This is Dark Souls, where every additional enemy puts your chances of living further and further down on the probability scale. And I think it's time we talk about spam.
Actually, it's time to talk about utilizing the environment.
Like, is the logic here that being spammed is better than being provided one?
I like how he's talking about the environment specifically in that section and then completely forgets that enemies can break objects by running into them. All right, let's go back to Mauler's clip during that.
This is Dark Souls, where every additional enemy puts your chances of living further and further down on the probability scale. And I think it's time we talk about spam.
When they run into those barrels, they just break, right? His opportunity to use these barrels against them has been taken away by the enemy just running towards him. That little dig with the explosive barrel is not an own. It is not consistent. It is not helpful when these enemies are spamming you and you're trying to use a very... This is one thing too. You're dealing with a game that has bad hitboxes, that has very long explosive delay from getting back up off the ground, and you expect players to use that consistently. Think about the game for a minute. Think about the game.
spam.
Actually, it's time to talk about utilizing the environment.
Like, is the logic here that being spammed is better than being provided one layered enemy because you have to utilize space as you flee for your life? Because this isn't God of War or Arkham Asylum, where the enemy count is irrelevant as you swipe through them all.
There are so many moments where he complains about spam, even though he would have not gotten spammed if he had just utilized the environment to easily deal with enemies instead of just trying to rush through areas. Mauler thinks that being able to utilize environmental traps to deal with enemies is very, very rare, because he clearly never paid enough attention.
This is something you could turn off in the menu, but most players will have this on at default.
Whoa. Shh. Dude, look at that. I almost died again because of the target lock system.
But the game gives up on the pretense of even having you walk to certain areas. Eventually, it simply demands that you become engulfed with enemies regardless of how you approached at the time. The fundamental of all of this is that a vast majority of battles in Dark Souls 2 are stuffed with enemies, and many of them are hoping to catch you off guard.
Oh god.
And weird interactions that can easily cause death. This means the system itself is objectively poorly designed.
He regularly used this room as an example of spam, but he also always showed clips of him just running through it without utilizing the environment at all. I just don't think that he can make objective statements about the amount of environmental traps that you can utilize if we basically never see him doing that.
You have to recognize your
I mean, I think this is also one thing too, right? That's the one thing I think about Mauler's footage from that little clip. I need to go back and check because if it's the first run with some of the stuff in the game, I feel like that is something that could help Mauler's argument. But if it's a subsequent run, it would help Domo's argument more. But again, it is that thing where you're continuing to layer spam in the encounter by just having tons and tons and tons of enemies in this area with environmental traps, many of whom can stun lock you off of a platform pretty easily, right? So at the end of the day, it's still a bunch of spam on tight walkways. Yes, the walkways can kill the enemies, but they are also very thin and can also kill you. So I don't think this is necessarily a point in either of their favor. I think this is just kind of a thing of, like, these encounters are incredibly hazardous to everything involved. Try to use it wisely. That's the best way I would probably put it. That also takes a deliberate amount of extra work to do rather than just running past the enemies or killing them the normal way. Yeah. I mean, again, it's just one of those things where like there are plenty of encounters. Like a lot of the encounters in Dark Souls 2 boil down to, if you enter an area with spam, retreat and pick at the horde, right? If there are a group of enemies that don't all activate at once, slowly lure them out, so you don't get spammed. A lot of these strategies to deal with this are a counter to the mechanics in place that allow the spam to happen, right? Now, in this area, there are plenty of examples of single fights that can become hazardous, multiple enemy fights that can become hazardous. So this area, I think, is particularly picked on because there's a lot of different enemies that are very tough. Or at the very least can be tough depending on when you tackle this pathway. But I think it is a problem inherently with the system when you have this many enemies on multiple walkways that can be changed to drop into a pool of lava that insta-kills things, on top of having archers that will shoot at you from multiple angles. You're still overclocking the difficulty by placing a bunch of different enemies in the same space with a bunch of environmental hazards on top of that. You're still overclocking the encounter with spam. It's just because the environment can be used to defeat them doesn't mean the encounter isn't still overclocked. It's that same problem again.
your environment and work with it. Let's open with the idea that there is indeed spam in this game. You've probably been convinced by the footage in the background, but to contextualize it,
Getting attacked for opening a chest without dealing with enemies first is not spam.
What?
Let's open with the idea that there is indeed spam in this game. You've probably been convinced by the footage in the background, but to contextualize it,
Getting attacked for opening a chest without dealing with enemies first is not spam. That's just
That's not spam. You mean interacting with something that takes a long time to open, leaves your character vulnerable to damage, and you're getting attacked by invisible enemies. Oh man, that's totally fair. There's nothing wrong with this situation whatsoever. I mean, this is also one thing where, like, when it comes to like the definition of spam, I think the definition of that is kind of it's sort of subjective, but we all kind of agree it deals with too much to deal with at one time. But in terms of where the actual number points are in that sort of statement, it fluctuates from person to person. So spam is a very weird thing to define.
poor gameplay. Especially as this area has weird-looking trees that moan at you, which you can use to distract the enemies.
This is also one thing too. This is again a knowledge thing. Like, who the fuck is gonna find out that the trees do this? Like, who's gonna willingly just attack a tree just because you can, right? Especially when you're probably getting attacked by ghost dudes. Like, who's gonna do that? Like, again, this is one thing where, like, I've seen several videos about like cool, unique things that Dark Souls 2 did. It's like a lot of these unique things are, yeah, they're interesting, but who the hell's gonna do it? Right? We're talking like less than 10% of the player base are going to just fuck around and try this shit.
So, back to the point about utilizing the environment. Dark Souls 2 is filled with moments where players that pay attention to their surroundings get rewarded with opportunities to easier deal with enemies.
Yeah, remember this. Remember this bit. Okay, this is very build specific. You have to parry him, and then run over. You have to parry him in a specific spot to use
Players
this.
that pay attention to their surroundings.
That is such a long-winded way to deal damage to him. You are better just to dodge and poke at him, right? Unless you have no weapons at all, right? And this encounter, Mauler made a specific point about this specific encounter where sometimes the explosion goes through the floor.
Get rewarded with opportunities.
And sometimes it hits you and sometimes it does not. You can go check the series. I forget which part it's in, but he does reference this point. So it is a thing where the environmental hazards can also damage you unfairly, seemingly at random sometimes, especially when it comes to explosive stuff, which is not good.
To easier deal with enemies. There are so many explosive barrels that you can utilize.
By the way, make sure to bring flaming arrows everywhere you go. For all the other builds that don't have, he keeps coming at this from a very specific lens of, I know all these different things that I can use to my advantage. Here, let me craft my build around every single individual encounter, instead of making your character the build that you want to make it, and then dealing with the environment around you as is. It's very, it seems like his build he's running with for all of his own footage in this is the I got you build. Look, cool thing can happen if you have this specific type of thing here to help you. It's like, yes, while that may be true, players want to make their own build and stick to that build. Like, I don't. This is sort of like the mind-numbing criticism where it's sort of a lot of the same points that just miss that players don't want to shift their entire play style around the gimmicks of the areas. You know, it's just one of those things that kind of makes it sort of mind-numbing to deal with. Because of the Happy Souls video, but yeah, more seriously, I'm sure a lot of players did miss the moaning trees. Yeah. Yeah, it's just one of those. There's a lot of stuff in these games that is interesting, you know, but when they fundamentally alter an encounter that's already got problems, that's not a good setup.
But Dark Souls 1 shows a lot more signs of crafted encounters. Dark Souls 2 seems to, as Matt put it, lack that level of design and simply adds more enemies to the fray to make it more difficult. It would seem that Harris explains that aspect away by saying the game is slightly different or has different types of challenge.
This different kind of challenge includes all the possibilities to utilize the environment to deal with enemies, instead of just running past them like Mauler tends to do. He thinks that DS2 just spammed enemies everywhere, because he keeps on running around to aggro more and more enemies instead of just dealing with them in smaller groups.
Bro, fuck you. Are you serious right now? You say Mauler's doing all that shit, and then you walk into a room and aggro 7 enemies? Are you fucking kidding me right now? Oh, man. Just, dude, think about your foot. Like, this is, of all the points to put this footage behind, he put it behind the point that goes against his argument to the extreme, right? Like, let's watch this clip again. Let's watch this little bit again where he goes into this area, right? All right. Let's watch this bit.
By saying the game is slightly different or has different types of challenge.
This different kind
Okay, look, there's a barrel over there that requires A, a bow, and B, something flaming. Okay?
of challenge
How many builds are going to have that? Probably not a majority. Probably not even like a quarter. Probably less.
includes all the
All
possibilities
right, look at that. Did that do
to
anything?
utilize the environment to deal with enemies.
Didn't kill any enemies. He did not get any souls from that. Effectively useless, as far as we can tell.
Instead of just running past them like Mauler tends to do. He thinks that DS2 just spammed enemies everywhere, because he keeps on running around to aggro
There were 3 enemies in there. There's an enemy
more
right
and more
there.
enemies instead of just dealing with them in smaller groups.
Another enemy.
What follows are
Right? Like there's 5 dudes in that room that activate from you walking in. That is the spam bush. That is what they're talking about with spam bushes. The environmental counteroffensives don't make up for the fact that the spam is still there. And many builds are not going to have the exact things necessary to counter it in an environmental way. Oftentimes, what people like I do is we use a glass cannon build, like we just have a big ass weapon and we just swing it side to side. That's usually enough to deal with the spam because we hit all of them within a couple swipes. Right? This is not the own you think it is. You know, this is similar to an argument of saying that Malekith doesn't have problems in Elden Ring because you have this one item that you can parry once during his combos that makes him stay still for enough time for you to hit him. It's like that doesn't counter all the extra bullshit in the Malekith fight. It's the same shit here. Just because there is a way to deal with it in an environmental way doesn't mean that this negates the encounters and the tedium that they have. Good catch. I didn't notice that him shooting that barrel did jack shit. I mean, unless he was hiding the HUD during that, which I don't know how hiding the HUD works in the game because I never do it. But like, unless hiding the HUD also hides damage numbers, I mean, I would assume that it didn't do anything. But it is one of those things where I don't think it did anything, but maybe I'm wrong. He did have his HUD off, but again, why are you having the HUD off all the damn time? Are you trying to hide the fact that these explosions do a lot of damage? I don't know. It makes you think. It's one of those things where every time that you hide details in a playthrough, you have to wonder why they do that. You know, because this is not default. It's not default to have none of your HUD available, right? You have to go out of your way for this. And I can understand for cinematic value, but if you're making a point about mechanics, you should probably leave these up.
few minutes of creative ways to deal with enemies. Lost Bastille, just like the Forest of Fallen Giants, is filled with explosive barrels. Earthen Peak has lots of poison urns.
Okay, I guess damage does not appear during the cinematic mode. Again, why are you making this more confusing by having the cinematic mode on?
Even Covetous Demon has a gimmick where you can shoot down the prisoners for him to eat. No Man's Wharf, the Gutter, and Black Gulch have oil that you can set on fire. These elevators might throw enemies down the cliff.
This is one of those things that he's forgetting oftentimes, is that just because these things can happen doesn't mean that you have the wherewithal to deal with them in a combat encounter, right? And that's, I think, one of the biggest things he's missing during this sort of section with the environmental trap stuff is your first thought when seeing an enemy is, oh, I have to go fight that enemy. It's not going to be, how can I use something in the environment to fuck with their AI and potentially insta kill them? Or, your first thought is, I'm going to engage in the core combat mechanics of this game, not I'm going to avoid the core combat mechanics and use the environment instead. Most players are not going to think that. And while all these options here is good, and this is a point that I think Mauler did get wrong, in terms of like just how many environmental things are available to use against the AI, you're not really proving the game is better. You're kind of just proving that the game's AI is kind of shit in places because they're this susceptible to all the status shit around or all the explosive barrels around. And this is also one thing too. All of these environmental traps do just as much for the player as against them, especially when you don't have a build for it, which I've harped on several times. If you don't have the build that makes the most of these traps, you are going to have a bad time. You are going to have issues. You are going to suffer.
I'm using that pillar to block the archers, but did you know about this small shortcut?
This sort of thing is avoided by pressing A quickly and won't even happen for those with perfect internet, so it's fine, but
We always see him fighting against all 6 here, which again makes me think that he massively exaggerates the amount of enemy spam by not paying any attention. And again, there are explosive barrels here that can make it easier to deal with this group of enemies.
I feel like this is just him just going on a tangent at this point where it's just like more environmental traps, more. It's like if this was really about showing environmental traps available in the game, I would just mention that Mahler got this wrong and then show probably a montage of several different environmental traps going on. And also that clip of Mahler talking, I'm pretty sure is him talking about the random internet pop-up that blocks your entire screen that can happen in the middle of playing the game, right? Where you can die, right? I don't think Mahler was actually making a point about anything about spam or the environment in that clip. I think he just included it just because he wanted to include a clip of Mahler going through this area. Hey, chat. How's it going? Hey, Shan. We're doing good. We're watching Domo's series. So far, it's kind of brain rotty. Thankfully, we're almost done with this video. And I'm planning to do roughly one video a stream. For shorter ones, I might do 2, but we'll see how far it goes. This is an 11-part series. I think we might get 9 parts out of it total. So expect about 2 months of this guy for better or worse.
I'm not even sure if this one counts, but I always enjoyed how cute it looks.
How cute it looks? Okay, chat. Watch this next clip. Right? Watch this next clip of what's happening here with the snowball going down and tell me if you think this is cute. Tell me if that's the word that comes to mind.
And let us.
All right, did you think that clip was cute? It's so cute. I wouldn't say cute is a good word to describe that. When you think of something cute, you think of something either something patronizing or you think of something involving something that is sort of like giddy. It's goofy. Yeah, I think goofy's a better word. I mean, I like it. I just still think it's kind of funny that we can hit a snowball and that's enough to kill enemies. It should break their poise and not damage them. I mean, it's just a big snowball.
Let's not forget about Broom Tower, which provides the player with so many opportunities.
This is one of those things where it's like, okay, you've made your point. Can we move on, please? Like, I'm fine with long content, but when you just make the same point over and over in the same area, it's just kind of like, dude, you're kind of just beating a dead horse at this point. Computer generated voice? Yes. Yeah, he uses an AI voice. Man, those clips showing the environmental traps available only proves that the AI is absolutely stupid in this game. You are not making the AI look intimidating.
Oh yes, marvelous.
Holy shit, is this Steam 2 FPS or the video is? It might be the stream. My internet's not that great. So if it's screwing up, that's probably my fault. I apologize. Also, quality keeps moving around for some reason. I think his video quality of Maulers' videos is actually crap though, because it seems very low res.
Look at that. When I don't think it can f me over anymore, it just finds another way, doesn't it? I wanted to kill the arrow guy, but nope. Let's lock onto the guy behind me.
This room looks so ganky without context, but in reality it is once again an obvious gimmick room where you are supposed to utilize the barrel holders that the game introduced in the previous rooms. You learn that they run away from you, and that they explode on contact with fire. Then the game shows you that they can easily take out strong enemies by placing them right next to fire and one of those annoying archers.
He just called the archers annoying. Skill issue much?
And now there's a room with lots of barrel holders and a giant enemy that spews fire. The obvious solution here is to just put those two together.
Yeah, this is the
using
ideal
Lurie's-
encounter, to just slowly drift the AI towards the big guy.
Spews fire.
Look at that. Look at that. This is peak Souls content. This is peak Souls content. Just fuck around until the AI do what you want them to.
Bring skulls for
Oh no. No Shahi defends this. This is a blatant spam bush. Yeah. Oh my god, he literally has no shame. He's a shill. I'm sorry, he's shilling, man. There are just problems.
for crowd control. But just having the barrel carriers down here already makes a huge difference, as you can always just lure the giant enemy to them.
You have to recognize your environment and work with it.
He does realize he's playing with an extremely niche build, right? Like Burning Arrow, Archer, Environmental build. He does realize that he's using a specific build to do all this shit, right? This is not the average player experience with the multiple builds with miracles, spells, swords, shields, stuff like that. He has to know this, right? Like, he has to know that just because there is a way to do it doesn't mean that most players are going to do it that way, right? Just because one person on the planet can play through the fire and flames on expert in Guitar Hero doesn't mean everyone can, right? Like, you have to understand that the exception is not the rule. Bro, look at the steps he's taking for one room. I bet this is his favorite room. Why are we watching this, Vangaris? I'm losing brain cells. We're watching this because this was recommended for us to watch. We've got 10 more videos to go. Yay. We're all going to be dead by the end of this. Thankfully, this video is almost over, and we're going to do one video a stream, hopefully. We can tackle more things later, but I do plan to end this soon.
You don't even need to go down there in order to deal with this room.
You don't even need to go into the encounter to deal with the encounter. It's like, are you understanding the problem? They are making encounters where we have to disregard the main combat mechanics of the fucking series. Do you understand that these are combat games? That is the primary thing we do. It is combat. We bash shit. We shoot pew-pews. It's like saying you can play Call of Duty with a throwing knife, and it makes the encounters way more interesting when it's a first-person shooter with guns. I really don't want to say what I want to say about this individual in particular because it's very mean, and I'm trying not to be mean, but it's very hard right now. It's very hard right now with this stuff. Ugh. Who recommended this? I'll find you. You beat me to it. You don't even need to interact with the AI to beat it. Oh no. Yeah, well, this is one thing. Talking about this bit where he's shooting them. What I normally do in this encounter is I normally have poison arrows. And then I just poison the big guys. Like whoever I can hit in this little crack, I poison them and then just wait. Because this encounter is just such shit if you try to do it normally. Anyway, we're nearly there. We're at a summary, so let's see what the summary is.
Let's open with the idea that there is indeed spam in this game. You've probably been convinced by the footage in the background, but to contextualize it, as Harris does claim that many content creators do not do, this is a series of encounters that naturally, with the fault of the player being full or null, play out to force you into fights with enemies from 3 to 15 in number.
The one hollow climbing up the ladder to block his escape route shows us that he can't even be bothered to fight the first enemies after the tutorial. He was never forced to fight so many enemies at once.
This, combined with several other fundamentals that we shall be getting to, enhance the levels of absolute incompetency when it comes to trying to craft a challenge. Please stop spamming me.
So, all in all, if you are someone that willingly decides to blindly rush through areas and then blames the game for spamming them, Dark Souls 2 will not be the correct game for you. In fact,
Dark Souls 2 will not be the correct game for you. Dude, your AI voice is making you sound less human than the AI with the way you word those things, man.
none of the FromSoft games will be fun to play if you just ignore every lesson these games teach you and never even try to engage with the areas.
Engaging with this area is understanding that there is a spam bush here if you try to loot the items and avoid things, so you try to cut enemies down. You are circumventing the problem again. The same shit in every single point you've made. The problems come from engaging with the encounter because the encounter itself is problematic. I've made this point however many times in this stream. The problem is there are a ton of enemies in this area that can be activated by trying to avoid damage from other enemies. That's the root problem. It's not that you can't slap them down. It's not that you have an archer shooting at you, putting pressure on you to move around. It's not all this shit. It's that you have stuffed the area full of enemies when you know that this game is not built to deal with multiple enemies at once, right? Just because you can doesn't mean it's built for it. This game is at its best when it is a 1v1. It stretches it when it's maybe a 1v2 or maybe a 2v2 or something, right? But when you deal with multiple enemies that can naturally appear just by running around the same arena, you've created an encounter that is essentially a spam bush. And now while you can see all these guys, this is just an omen of what's to come later on in the game. And again, Domo is fundamentally missing the main problem with the spam bushes. It's the same shit over and over again. It's the same problem over and over again. It's the same result over and over again. It's the same solution over and over again. It's fucking boring. Not to mention incredibly unfair when you just try to dodge shit and you activate more enemies. I'll say it, he's a blind fanboy and most likely believes the game can do no wrong. He's exactly what I feared he'd be. This is one thing too, just show some criticism of the game. Like at all. Right? Just show some level of like level-headedness regarding this.
Mauler and his friends experienced a lot of spam, but nearly all of that was simply caused by them running around to aggro a whole lot of enemies, instead of fighting them before the situation escalates. Like a wise man once said,
You have to recognize your environment and work with it.
there were so many moments where they did not even try to work with it, and then accused the game of just being unfair. Engage with the game, immerse yourself, be creative, utilize the environment, use consumables. Don't just blindly run through new areas and instead try to understand them, and then you will have a fun time in this game.
What? What the hell was that last clip? Here, let me show you this incredibly niche way to deal with this that every player will figure out. It's like, what the fuck? All right, we're done. One video down. He's hurting my brain. He's hurting my brain. He can't, LeMayo. He doesn't know any criticisms of the game. Oh, man. That was a series of things, I guess. It's one of those things where I'm just like looking at. It's one of those things where like everybody is one of those. It's one of those things where he painted Mauler's video in an incredibly bad light, right? And this is one thing I think Mauler did get some things wrong during that, or at the very least could have worded things a little better. But this video is very dishonest in the way it responds to like the enemy spam thing. And this is the thing too. This video with its title of unfair enemy spam or skill issue is very much a dig at the community that dislikes Dark Souls 2. Like it is going into it being antagonistic. And it's very obvious that the ultra Dark Souls 2 fanboys, and I'm saying the ultra fanboys because I'm going to lump them into that term as being the ones that are irrational fans of this game. Right? I consider myself a fan of this game, and I know some people in chat are fans of this game, but you can at least acknowledge that there are problems in it, right? The ultra fanboys can't get Dark Souls 2 out of their ass, right? It has just fucked them to the point into submission, and they just won't agree to any sort of shortcoming, it seems. And also just the antagonism towards people during this and the way that the video sort of represents it, I think is just it drips with the venom of vengeance for someone attacking their sacred love. It's just one of those things that just gets really annoying to react to over and over. This is going to be a long series of pain, probably. This is going to be a long series of pain. Anyway, that's going to be it for this stream today. I'll be picking this up next Saturday, I think. I don't think I have anything going on. But we should be back next time. And once again, welcome to the new year. Happy New Year to everybody. Let's make 2025 a good year. Let's react to many things that are fun and hopefully something more uplifting or interesting than just Dark Souls 2 defense brain rot at this point. It just gets old. In other words, play extremely slowly, use niche, potentially boring things like firebombs, bows, and overexert your brain for every room. Yeah, basically autist your way through the game, pretty much. My brain hurts too. Yes. It's my fave, but come on, it has its flaws like every Souls game. Yes. Ciao, take care. Happy 2025. Happy 2025, everybody. We'll be back with this hopefully next Saturday. And we'll probably continue on in that fashion until we're done with the series. I don't know what I'm going to cover next. Right now, see, let me bring up my little list here. Yeah, so the only other thing I have, the only other video I have to react to that's like a proper video is Joseph Anderson's Soma video. That's the next one on my list to react to. And I don't remember how long it is. I haven't looked it up. But that might be the video that we do after this, just because I need a little bit of a break from the Souls series, you know. I need a little bit of wiggle room. Just need a little bit of wiggle room to like get into some other things. But yeah, so once again, just thank you all for watching. Welcome to the new year, and I will see you guys later.